"I've been lost out here for 3 days," the little girl said to the woman, but what she revealed was terrifying. Watch until the end. Comment telling me what you thought of this story with a rating from 0 to 10. I really want to know if you liked my story and subscribe to my channel to support my work. I'm counting on your help. The deafening roar of the diesel engine echoed across the dark waters of the Mississippi Delta as Grace Farrell, 57, felt the familiar tightness in her chest that had been her companion for 8 months. Her calloused hands gripped the wheel of the North Star, the only boat left from a fleet that had once promised to support her with dignity. The smell of burnt oil mixed with the sweet, humid air of the Louisiana bayou, creating an atmosphere that once calmed her, but now only intensified her anguish. On that late November afternoon, with the sun setting over the muddy waters that cut through the fictional town of Port Serenity like a golden scar, Grace was transporting 5 tourists from Dallas who had paid in advance to see the region's natural beauty. The money in her hands represented more than a simple business transaction. It was her last, desperate attempt to prevent the regional credit union from seizing her vessel the next day. Owen always said this life on the river was too dangerous for a woman alone, she muttered to herself, remembering the bitter words her husband had left as a farewell 2 years ago. He had left one March morning, taking with him not just his clothes and documents, but also any hope Grace still held of rebuilding the river tour business they had created together. The family business had thrived for 15 years, serving isolated bayou communities and transporting curious tourists along the lesser-known routes of the Delta. But when Owen decided he couldn't take the financial hardships and constant pressure from creditors anymore, Grace found herself alone, facing accumulated debts that seemed to grow like the river's annual flood, inexorable and devastating. Now, at 57, with her grey hair tied in a simple bun and expression lines deeply etched into her weathered face, she watched the green banks of the bayou, trying not to think about the yellow envelope that had arrived the previous morning. The letter from the credit union was clear. She had until the end of that week to pay off the 8 months of overdue installments or lose her boat for good. "Mrs. Farrell, how much longer until we get to the spot where we can see the dolphins?" asked one of the tourists, an elegant middle-aged woman wearing expensive clothes entirely unsuitable for a river expedition. "About 40 minutes, Mrs. Clare," Grace replied, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "We'll soon be at the confluence where the bayou meets the wider channel where they usually appear in the late afternoon." The tourists resumed their lively conversations, taking photos with expensive phones and commenting on the landscapes that passed by the small vessel's windows. Grace momentarily envied their carefree attitude, remembering a time when she too could appreciate the beauty of the waters without feeling the constant weight of survival on her shoulders. Her simple wooden house on the outskirts of Port Serenity had been mortgaged for 6 months, and the little money she managed to earn from tourist trips barely covered her basic needs. There were days she ate only grits and canned fish, saving every extra penny in the impossible hope of paying off at least part of the suffocating debt. As the boat approached a small, secluded cove surrounded by dense vegetation, Grace slowed the engine so the tourists could admire the scenery. It was a place she knew well, a quiet bend in the river where the waters formed small natural pools among the exposed roots of the trees growing on the bank. It was then that she saw something that shouldn't be there. A small human figure crouched by the water, drinking directly from the river with cupped hands. The child wore only a torn, dirty t-shirt that had lost its original color, and her dark hair was matted and full of dry leaves. "My God," Grace whispered, cutting the engine completely. "There's a child there all alone." The tourists turned to where she was pointing, and a heavy silence fell over the boat. The girl had noticed the boat's presence and stood up slowly, revealing a thin, frightened little face that couldn't be more than 4 years old. "It can't be," murmured Mrs. Clare, bringing a hand to her mouth. "A child so young alone in a place like this?" Grace had already started the engine again, carefully approaching the bank so as not to frighten the girl further. Her decades of experience navigating the bayous had taught her that children lost in the wilderness rarely survived more than 2 days without help. "Hey, little one," she called in a gentle voice, bringing the boat closer to a thick root that served as a small makeshift dock. "Are you okay? Where are your parents?" The child took a few steps back, but didn't run. Her large, dark eyes stared at Grace with a mixture of fear and desperate hope. When she spoke, her voice was just a hoarse whisper that barely crossed the distance between them. "I've been lost out here for 3 days, the girl said, and then her small legs gave way under the weight of exhaustion and hunger, causing her to faint into the damp mud of the bank. Grace leaped from the vessel without hesitation, her feet sinking into the soft mud as she ran toward the unconscious girl. The tourists remained in shocked silence, watching the scene that had turned their leisure trip into something much more serious and urgent. "Lily," the child murmured when Grace took her in her arms, her frail little body weighing less than it should for a 4-year-old. "My name is Lily." "It's all right now, sweetie," Grace whispered, her heart aching as she realized how malnourished and dehydrated the girl was. Her skin was burned by the southern sun, and small scratches covered her thin legs, evidence of days wandering alone through the dense vegetation. Mrs. Clare had approached the edge of the boat, her eyes welling up. "We need to get her to a hospital immediately. The child could be severely dehydrated." "The nearest hospital is in Port Serenity," Grace replied, carrying Lily back to the boat. "About 40 minutes from here, if we push the engine." As she settled the girl on the boat's cushioned bench, Grace noticed something that worried her even more. Lily murmured incomprehensible things in her moments of semi-consciousness, fragments of words that seemed to carry terror: man yelling, woman crying, bad smell of dead fish. Now, the North Star's engine roared at full throttle as Grace navigated back to Port Serenity, but her mind was torn between the medical urgency of the situation and a deeper concern. Where were this child's parents? How had such a young girl ended up alone on a riverbank, miles from any known community? During the return trip, the tourists took turns caring for Lily, offering small sips of water and trying to keep her awake. The girl would open her eyes from time to time, looking around in confusion, but always returning to a worrying state of drowsiness. "She needs medical care, but she'll also need a place to stay," commented Mrs. Clare, stroking Lily's matted hair. "A child doesn't just disappear like that. Someone must be looking for her." Grace nodded, but a part of her wondered if that was true. There was something in the way Lily reacted to certain words and sounds that suggested trauma, not just the natural disorientation of a lost child. When they finally reached the Port Serenity dock, the sun had set completely, leaving the town illuminated by the yellowish lights of the street lamps and houses scattered on the hills near the river. Grace carried Lily off the boat, followed by the tourists who insisted on accompanying her to the hospital. The parish general hospital was crowded as always, with people waiting for care on worn plastic chairs under the cold white light of fluorescent tubes. When Grace appeared at the reception desk carrying a malnourished and seemingly abandoned child, the atmosphere in the place changed immediately. "Where did you find her?" asked the on-duty nurse, a sturdy middle-aged woman who examined Lily with professional concern. "On the riverbank, alone for at least 3 days, Grace replied. "She was drinking water directly from the bayou when I found her." The nurse made quick notes on a chart and called a doctor, who appeared a few minutes later. Dr. Frank Stevens was a young man who had recently graduated and chosen to work in the Delta out of idealism, but he had already seen enough cases of child neglect to recognize the signs. "We'll need to hydrate her and run some tests," he said, taking Lily into his arms carefully. "And we'll also have to notify social services about the case." The doctor's words made Grace's stomach clench. She knew what that meant. Lily would be sent into the social care system, probably to a state shelter where she would spend months, maybe years, waiting for someone to claim or adopt her. For the next 3 hours, Grace remained at the hospital while Lily received medical care. The tourists had said their goodbyes, grateful to have been part of the rescue, but eager to return to their hotels. Mrs. Claire left her card, asking to be kept informed about the girl's condition. When Dr. Stevens returned with an update, his face was more serious. "Physically, she'll recover well. Moderate dehydration, some scrapes, but nothing severe. What worries me are the signs of psychological trauma." "What kind of trauma?" Grace asked, though a part of her already suspected the answer. "She has nightmares even during medicated sleep, and she reacts with extreme fear to certain words and situations. I don't believe she simply got lost. Something happened to this child before she ended up on the riverbank." Grace nodded gravely. "And now? Where does she go?" "Brenda Sampson, the social worker, is coming in the morning to evaluate the case. Lily will likely be transferred to the state shelter until we can locate her family or find a suitable foster family." That night, Grace returned to her wooden house on the outskirts of Port Serenity with a heavy heart. The simple structure of 2 rooms and a small porch seemed even emptier than usual. There was a guest room that hadn't been used since Owen had left, a space that could house a child who clearly needed care and affection. Sitting on the porch, listening to the city's nocturnal sounds mixed with the distant murmur of the river, Grace made a life-changing decision. She couldn't let Lily become just another number in the social care system. There was something about that girl that had awakened a protective instinct in her she hadn't felt in years. The next morning, Grace was back at the hospital before 7, carrying a backpack with children's clothes she had bought at a second-hand store on the way. Lily was awake, sitting on the hospital bed, slowly eating a bowl of oatmeal. "Hi, little one," Grace said softly, approaching the bed. "Remember me?" Lily looked up and nodded shyly. For the first time, Grace could clearly see the girl's face, clean and with her hair combed. She was a beautiful child, with delicate features and expressive eyes that carried a sadness far too old for her age. "You're going to be okay now," Grace promised, sitting on the edge of the bed. "I'm going to take care of you." It was at that moment that Brenda Sampson entered the room, carrying a folder full of forms and wearing an expression that promised no flexibility. Brenda Sampson, 45, was known in Port Serenity for her administrative rigidity and for never making exceptions to the social care system's rules. Her erect posture and piercing gaze intimidated even experienced hospital staff, and Grace immediately sensed she was in for a tough battle. "Mrs. Farrell," Brenda said, consulting her papers without looking up. "I understand you were the one who found the minor, Lily. I need to ask you some questions about the circumstances of the discovery." "Of course," Grace replied, instinctively moving closer to the bed, where Lily watched the conversation with frightened eyes. "The child will be transferred today to St. Francis Shelter, where she will receive appropriate care while we investigate her origins," Brenda continued, finally looking up. "It's standard procedure in cases of abandonment or risk." "What if I wanted to take care of her?" Grace asked, surprising herself with the firmness in her own voice. "Temporarily, until you find the family." Brenda snapped the folder shut. "Mrs. Farrell, Temporary guardianship isn't something decided on impulse. There are strict criteria: financial stability, adequate housing, a clean criminal record, psychological evaluation. The process can take months. I have my own home. I've never had trouble with the law, and this child needs love, not just procedures, Grace retorted, feeling her frustration grow. She's been through enough trauma already. Exactly why she needs professional care, Brenda said, reopening the folder. At the shelter, she'll have proper psychological support and... No, a small, clear voice cut through the argument. Lily had sat up in bed, her eyes fixed on Brenda. I don't want to go to another place. I want to stay with Aunt Grace. The silence that followed was heavy. Brenda looked at the girl with a softened, yet still professional expression. Honey, you need to go to a place where trained people can take care of you. Aunt Grace saved me, Lily said, her voice gaining strength. She's good. The other places. The girl shivered and fragments of memories seemed to cross her face. I don't want to go to places with a bad smell. Grace's heart tightened as she realized Lily associated the idea of institutions with something traumatic from her past. Please, she said to Brenda, give me a chance, at least until she recovers better. Brenda closed her eyes for a moment, clearly torn between protocol and the specific situation before her. I'll need to evaluate your residence this afternoon, and you will have to undergo all the required procedures, any irregularities, and the child will be transferred immediately. And so, 3 hours later, Grace found herself nervously tidying her wooden house while waiting for Brenda's visit. She had cleaned every corner, organized the guest room that would be Lily's, and tried to hide the most obvious signs of her financial difficulties. Lily was sitting on the porch, still fragile, but watching with curiosity as children played on the dirt road. It was the first time she had smiled since being found, a shy smile that appeared when she saw the boys flying kites in the late afternoon. I like it here, she told Grace. It's quiet, there's no yelling. This simple observation confirmed Grace's suspicions about the girl's traumatic past. You'll be safe here, she promised. No one will yell at you. When Brenda arrived, accompanied by a younger social worker, Grace tried to stay calm. The inspection was thorough. They checked the house's structure, the safety of the electrical installations, the availability of clean water, and adequate space for a child. The house is in reasonable condition, Brenda admitted, making notes. But I need to know about your financial situation, Mrs. Farrell. How do you plan to support a child? It was at that moment that Grace felt the full weight of her difficulties. How could she explain that she was about to lose her only means of support? How could she admit that sometimes she didn't even have money for her own basic needs? I work in river tourism, she said, trying to sound confident. It's a seasonal business, but it provides enough for our needs. Brenda didn't seem convinced, but before she could ask more questions, a black car pulled up in front of the house. Out of it stepped Marcus Miller, a 62-year-old man Grace knew by sight. He owned 3 seafood processing plants in the region and had a reputation for being influential in local political circles. Good afternoon, Mrs. Farrell, Miller said, greeting her with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. I heard you found a lost little girl. Such a sad situation. Good afternoon, Mr. Miller, Grace replied, surprised by the visit. How did you hear about it? Oh, news travels fast in a small town like Port Serenity, he said, glancing discreetly at Lily, who had hidden behind Grace upon seeing the strange man. I came to offer help. I know raising a child isn't easy, especially with the difficulties we all face. Brenda watched the interaction with professional interest. Do you know the child's family? Not that I'm aware of, Miller answered quickly, but I believe in the importance of the community helping each other. I thought I'd offer some financial support to Mrs. Farrell should she get custody of the girl. The offer took everyone by surprise. Grace felt a momentary relief at the thought that her financial struggles might be eased. But something about Miller's behavior made her uncomfortable. His eyes remained fixed on Lily in a way that seemed inappropriate. "That's very generous of you," Brenda said, clearly impressed. "Community support is always looked upon favorably in our reports." "Of course, I'd like to follow the child's progress," Miller continued. "Maybe make regular visits, see how she's adapting. After all, an investment needs to be monitored." The way he said monitored made Lily cling tighter to Grace's skirt. The girl said nothing, but her whole body had tensed at the man's presence. "That can be arranged," Brenda said, making more notes. "Additional supervision always contributes to the child's well-being." Miller smiled broadly. "Perfect. I can start helping as early as tomorrow. And of course, I'd like to talk with little Lily, get to know her better." It was at that moment that Lily did something unexpected. She tugged on Grace's skirt and whispered something only she could hear. "He smells just like the mean uncle who hurts." A chill ran down Grace's spine. She looked at Miller with new eyes, noticing details that had previously gone unnoticed. The way his eyes lingered on Lily, the possessive way he talked about monitoring the child, and most importantly, how his presence had transformed a girl who was beginning to feel safe into a terrified creature. "I very much appreciate your offer, Mr. Miller," Grace said, forcing a smile, "but I think it's best to let Lily get settled in first before she has visitors." Miller's face darkened for a split second before returning to the forced smile. Of course, no rush, but my offer still stands." After he left, Brenda finished her evaluation with a more positive expression. "Community support weighs heavily in your favor," she said. "I'll recommend temporary guardianship, but with strict supervision. Any problems, and the situation will be reassessed." That night, when she was finally alone with Lily, Grace gently asked about the comment the girl had made about Miller. The answer she received left her alert and worried about what was to come. "The mean uncle who hurts had a strong smell of dead fish," Lily whispered in the darkness of the small room, her voice trembling as Grace covered her with a clean sheet. "And he always said I was special, that I was going to work for him when I grew up." Grace felt her blood run cold. She sat on the edge of the bed and gently stroked the girl's hair, trying to keep her voice calm. "Lily, sweetie, that man who came here today, did he remind you of the mean uncle?" The girl nodded, her big eyes shining in the dark. "The smell is the same, and the eyes too. The mean uncle looked at me the same way." Over the next week, Grace tried to establish a normal routine for Lily, but the shadow of Miller's visit hung over them both. In the mornings, she took the girl for short walks through downtown Port Serenity, buying her new clothes with the little money she had saved. In the afternoons, she tried to work, offering short river tours to last-minute tourists. But business was becoming increasingly scarce. The high tourist season had passed, and the December rains were approaching, a time when river traffic dwindled drastically. The credit union's deadline had expired, and she received daily calls demanding payment of the overdue installments. It was on one of these difficult mornings that Miller appeared again, this time unannounced. Grace was in the kitchen making coffee when she heard his voice on the porch, talking to Lily, who was playing alone. "What a beautiful doll you have there," he was saying, and Grace could hear the syrupy tone that made her uncomfortable. "I bet you like playing with pretty things." Grace quickly came out of the kitchen and found Miller crouching next to Lily, who had shrunk against the porch wall, clutching a cloth doll Grace had sewn for her. "Mr. Miller," she said, trying to keep her voice firm, "I wasn't expecting you." "Ah, Mrs. Farrell." He stood up with a smile that didn't hide his irritation at being interrupted. "I came to see how you're adapting, and I brought a proposal that might interest you." "What kind of proposal?" Miller took an envelope from his pocket. $15,000 cash. "I know you're having financial problems, and this would be enough to pay off your debts with the credit union and still have some left over for the girl's expenses. Grace's heart raced. It was exactly the amount she needed. As if he knew details about her financial situation he shouldn't know. And in return, nothing much, he said, his eyes turning back to Lily. I'd just like to have regular access to the girl. Let's say, visit her a few times a week. Maybe take her to see one of my properties. I have a fish farm on Cypress Creek. Kids like that sort of thing. Lily had begun to tremble visibly, and Grace noticed the girl had wet her pants, something that hadn't happened for several days since she had started to feel safe. I appreciate the offer, Grace said, moving to stand between Miller and Lily. But I can't accept. Lily is still recovering from trauma. Miller's face hardened. Mrs. Farrell, I don't think you quite understand the situation. Without my help, you'll lose the boat. And without an income, Brenda will take the girl from you and put her in the shelter. Is that a threat? It's reality. He put the envelope back in his pocket. Think about it. I have enough influence to make your life here in Port Serenity very easy or very difficult. After he left, Grace found Lily crying in the bathroom, trying to clean herself up. Is he going to take me away? Aunt Grace, the girl asked between sobs. Never, Grace promised, hugging her tightly. I will never let anyone hurt you. But that night, alone on the porch while Lily slept, Grace faced the bitter reality of her situation. The next day, the repossession officer would visit to collect her boat. Without it, she would have no way to work. Without an income, she would lose custody of Lily. And Miller knew this perfectly well. It was then that she remembered something Lily had mentioned, the smell of dead fish. Miller had seafood plants and apparently a property on Cypress Creek where he raised fish. There was more to this story, something that connected Lily's traumatic past with his obsessive interest in the girl. The next morning, determined to find out more about Miller, Grace left Lily with Mrs. Rosa, a trusted neighbor, and went to the Central Market in Port Serenity. There she spoke with other vendors, feigning interest in buying fish to resell to tourists. Marcus Miller, said old Ben, a retired fisherman who knew everyone in the area. That one's got some strange business dealings, always buying questionable quality fish too cheap. And he's got a property out on Cypress Creek that nobody really knows what goes on at. What do you mean, questionable quality? Fish that should have been rejected, you know. Sometimes even a bit spoiled. He buys it for a low price and sells it as if it's fresh. I've heard of complaints filed against him with the health department, but nothing ever comes of it. Grace felt a pang of intuition. And do you know anyone who works for him? There are some poor souls he exploits out at that property, said Marcy, a produce vendor. Desperate people who'll take any job. They say the pay is miserable and the conditions are terrible. When Grace returned home, she found an official car parked out front. The repossession officer had arrived an hour earlier than expected, accompanied by Brenda, who looked deeply concerned. Mrs. Farrell, the officer said, showing the documents, I need to repossess the vessel registered as the North Star to settle a debt with the regional credit union. And I, Brenda added, need to reassess the situation of the minor, Lily. Without proof of stable income, I cannot maintain the temporary guardianship. Grace felt her world collapsing around her. In a few hours, she would lose both her source of livelihood and the girl she had come to love as a daughter. And she knew Miller was behind all this pressure, using his influence to force her to accept his proposal. It was then that she heard a familiar voice coming from the neighboring house. Excuse me, can I help? It was Hope Taylor, 38, a woman who lived in the stilt houses near the river, and whom Grace had seen a few times at the market, but had never really spoken to. Hope approached slowly, her eyes fixed on Lily, who was playing in the yard oblivious to the adults' turmoil. I know this girl, Hope said, her voice trembling with emotion. She's my daughter. The silence that followed was deafening. Brenda looked up from her papers. The officer stopped checking the documents, and Grace felt as if the ground had disappeared from under her feet. Lily, who had been distracted playing, looked up at the sound of Hope's voice. For a moment, mother and daughter looked at each other across the yard, and something changed in the girl's expression, a mixture of recognition and fear that broke Grace's heart. "Mommy?" Lily's voice came out as a broken whisper, and she dropped the cloth doll she was holding, taking a few hesitant steps toward Hope. But then she stopped abruptly, as if a terrible memory had crossed her mind, and ran back to hide behind Grace. Hope collapsed in tears, falling to her knees on the dirt of the yard. "My child, my little Lily, I thought you had drowned. I've been looking for you for months." Brenda immediately took control of the situation, grabbing her clipboard and approaching Hope with a professional posture. "Mom, I need to verify your identity and confirm your claim. Do you have documents to prove maternity?" "I do," Hope said, pulling a crumpled birth certificate and some folded papers from her bag. "Lily Taylor Santos, born March 15th, 2020. I'm Hope Taylor Santos, a single mother." As Brenda examined the documents, Grace watched the interaction between mother and daughter with a broken heart. It was obvious that Lily recognized Hope, but there was fear mixed with the recognition, as if something terrible had happened between them before the disappearance. "The documents appear to be authentic," Brenda said after a few minutes, "but I need to understand the circumstances of the child's disappearance. How did your daughter end up alone on the riverbank?" Hope wiped her tears and looked around nervously, as if checking if someone was watching her. "It's a complicated story, and a dangerous one. I don't know if I can talk here like this." The repossession officer, who had been forgotten during the family drama, cleared his throat loudly. "Ma'am, I still need to execute my warrant. The boat has to be seized today." "Please," Grace begged, feeling that losing the boat now was the least of her problems. "Can you give me a few days, until we resolve Lily's situation?" "Impossible," the officer replied. "A court order has no extensions." It was at that moment that Hope stood up, wiping her face with determination. "I'll pay the debt. How much is it?" Everyone turned to her, surprised. Brenda frowned. "Mrs. Taylor, where do you live? What is your occupation? I need to assess your conditions to have the child returned to you." "I live in the stilt houses in the Prania neighborhood," Hope answered, her chin held high with dignity despite her humble situation. "I work selling fish at the market. I don't have much, but I have enough love for my daughter." "Stilt houses are not considered adequate housing for a child," Brenda said automatically. "Besides, I need to understand how you initially lost custody of the minor." Hope looked around nervously again before answering. "I never officially lost custody. We were running away from a dangerous situation. The boat capsized during a storm. I managed to save myself, but I thought Lily had drowned. I've been looking for her ever since." "Running away from what?" Grace asked, a suspicion growing in her mind. "From a man who wanted to use my daughter for bad things." Hope lowered her voice. "He was blackmailing me, said that if I didn't hand Lily over to him, he would report me for selling spoiled fish at the market." Grace's heart pounded. This man, did he own seafood plants? Did he smell like dead fish? Hope looked at her in surprise. "How did you know?" "Marcus Miller," Grace said, and she saw immediate terror flash across Hope's face. "You know him?" Hope whispered, instinctively looking over her shoulder. He said he knew where I sold fish that was sometimes a little past its prime, that I had to sell cheap so I wouldn't lose everything. He said he'd report me to the health department if I didn't let Lily spend time at his property." "Property on Cypress Creek?" Grace asked, the pieces of the puzzle falling into place. "Yes, he said he was going to teach her to work." that a child had to learn from a young age to be useful. Hope shivered. I took Lily there just once to see. What I saw has haunted me. Brenda had stopped writing and was paying full attention to the conversation. What exactly did you see, ma'am? Children working like adults, processing fish in terrible conditions. Some looked sick, others were too scared to speak. And Miller, the way he looked at them. Hope couldn't finish the sentence. Lily, who had remained silent, clinging to Grace's skirt, finally spoke. The mean uncle hurt the kids who didn't work right, and he said I was going to live there when Mommy couldn't take care of me anymore. The silence that followed was heavy with horror and understanding. Even the repossession officer had stopped shuffling his papers to listen. Is that why you tried to run away with her? Grace asked softly. I took our old little boat one night when Miller had been drinking too much and was distracted, Hope explained. I wanted to go to a town called Obidos, where my sister lives. But the storm came out of nowhere, the boat flipped, and when I managed to swim to the bank, Lily had disappeared in the current. And you didn't seek official help? Brenda asked. With what? Hope laughed bitterly. Miller has influence in town. He knows important people. Who would believe a poor woman who sells questionable fish against a respected businessman? Grace felt a chill as she realized she had almost fallen into the same trap. Miller had offered money in exchange for access to Lily, using her financial difficulties as leverage to get what he wanted. We have to do something, she said, looking at Brenda. If this story is true. It is true, a new voice interrupted. Everyone turned to see a woman of about 35 approaching. She was thin, with simple work clothes and a face that showed deep exhaustion. I'm Diana, she said. Hope's sister. I work as a cleaner at the city hall, and I can confirm everything she said. Diana looked around to make sure she wasn't being watched before continuing. Miller has a scheme with Julian Baxter, a city hall employee. Julian forges custody and transfer documents for minors. I saw the papers when I was cleaning his office. What kind of documents? Brenda asked, clearly alarmed. Transfers of orphaned or at-risk children to Miller's rural educational property, Diana explained. Officially, it was to teach them agricultural skills. In reality, it was slave labor, Hope finished, and worse things for the younger girls. Lily began to cry softly, and Grace picked her up. The girl whispered in her ear, I don't want to go back there, Aunt Grace. Please don't let me go back. It was at that moment that Grace realized the situation was much bigger than a simple custody issue. Miller wasn't just a man with an inappropriate interest in children. He was running a systematic operation of exploitation, using his position in the community and corrupt contacts to get victims. And now that Lily had reappeared, he would surely do anything to get her back, especially knowing she had witnessed his illegal activities. We have to protect this child, Brenda said, her professional demeanor giving way to genuine human concern. And investigate these allegations. Investigating could take months, Diana said. And in the meantime, Miller will continue doing what he does. He must already know that Lily has turned up. As if summoned by her words, the sound of a car engine approaching made everyone look toward the street. Miller had arrived, and he wasn't alone. Miller got out of the car accompanied by Julian Baxter, a 51-year-old man with a prominent belly and thick glasses that reflected the afternoon sun. Julian carried a leather briefcase and had the confident expression of someone who knew he had enough bureaucratic authority to resolve any situation in his favor. What an interesting gathering, Miller said, observing the group in Grace's yard with a smile that didn't hide his irritation. I heard our little Lily had an emotional family reunion. Hope instinctively moved behind Grace, and Lily began to tremble visibly in her arms. The girl buried her face in Grace's neck and whispered, "Don't let them take me." Julian here has brought some documents that might clarify the legal situation, Miller continued, gesturing to the City Hall employee. Apparently, there are pending issues regarding the child's custody that need to be regularized. Julian opened his briefcase and pulled out several official-looking papers with stamps and seals. I have here a court order issued 6 months ago determining that the minor Lily Taylor Santos be placed in institutional care due to the disappearance of her legal guardians. Brenda frowned, reaching out to examine the documents. I was not notified of any court order involving this child. It's a determination from a specialized court, Julian said quickly. Cases of missing minors follow different protocols, and considering the circumstances, it was determined that the child should be transferred to a specialized rural institution for rehabilitation. What institution? Grace asked, though she already suspected the answer. The St. Sebastian's Educational Farm, on Cypress Creek, Miller replied with false solemnity. A property specialized in caring for traumatized children through therapeutic agricultural activities. Hope couldn't contain herself. That's a lie. That farm is nothing but a place where he exploits children. Watch your words, ma'am, Julian said, adjusting his glasses. Slander against an institution registered with the city can have serious legal consequences. Diana stepped forward, her face pale but determined. I work at the City Hall. I know those documents are forged. The silence that followed was tense. Julian and Miller exchanged quick glances, clearly not expecting this intervention. That's a very serious accusation, Julian said, trying to maintain his composure. I suggest you be careful what you say. I cleaned your office last night, Diana continued, ignoring the implied threat. I saw you altering dates on transfer documents for minors. I know how you forge stamps using the seal from the family court that you keep in your file. Miller lost his patience. Enough of this whole charade. The child is coming with me today, whether you like it or not. I have the legal authority and sufficient resources to enforce it. It was at that moment that a new voice joined the discussion. Actually, you don't. Everyone turned to see a man of about 50 approaching the group. He was tall, dark-haired, with the simple clothes of a fisherman, but there was something in his posture that suggested determination and experience. Owen. Grace felt as if she had been punched in the stomach. It was her husband, who had disappeared 2 years ago without explanation. Hi, Grace, he said softly, but his eyes remained fixed on Miller with an intensity that made the businessman take a step back. I'm sorry it took me so long to come back. Owen Farrell, Miller said, clearly recognizing him. I thought you had left the region for good. I didn't leave. I just stayed and watched, Owen replied, pulling a plastic folder full of papers and photographs from the backpack he was carrying, watching and documenting the activities at your educational farm. Grace was still too shocked to fully process what was happening. Owen, where have you been all these years? In a bayou community on Cypress Creek, investigating Miller's operations, he explained, without taking his eyes off the businessman. After I witnessed what was really happening at his property, I knew I had to gather evidence before I could come home. What kind of evidence? Brenda asked, professionally interested. Owen opened the folder and spread photographs on the yard's ground. They were disturbing images, children working in precarious conditions, sleeping in overcrowded sheds, being supervised by armed men. 16 children between 6 and 14, all supposedly orphaned or abandoned, working 12 hours a day processing fish, Owen explained. No formal education, no proper medical care, no contact with the outside world. Miller tried to grab the photographs, but Owen was faster, gathering them back into the folder. These are copies, he said. The originals are in a safe place, along with testimonies from 3 children I managed to get off the property. You can't prove anything, Miller said, but his voice had lost its earlier confidence. And even if you could, do you have any idea who you're messing with? I do, Owen answered calmly. I know you have contacts at City Hall, on the City Council, even at the local sheriff's office. I know you use those connections to protect your illegal activities. Julian tried to intervene. The documents I brought are legitimate. The child needs to be transferred today. Actually, no, a new voice said. It was Anne Bailey, a senior social services investigator, now accompanied by 2 assistants and an official photographer. Anne, Brenda said, visibly relieved. How did you hear about this? Diana came to me last night with evidence of official document forgery, Anne Bailey explained, looking directly at Julian. I brought document experts to examine the papers you've presented. One of Anne's assistants approached Julian and held out his hand. We need to examine the documents you brought today. This is absurd, Julian protested, but he handed over the papers with trembling hands. While the experts examined the documents, Owen approached Grace. I'm sorry for disappearing like that, he said quietly. But when I saw what Miller was doing to those kids, I knew that if I tried to report it back then, without enough evidence, he would use his influence to bury everything. You could have told me, Grace replied, still struggling with conflicting emotions. I thought you had abandoned me. I never abandoned you, Owen said, pulling several bank transfer receipts from his pocket. I sent money whenever I could, through third parties. Not much, but enough to help with basic expenses. Grace looked at the receipts in surprise. For the past 2 years, she'd received small, anonymous sums that she had always attributed to the charity of neighbors or the occasional generosity of tourists. The documents are forged, one of the experts announced. Overlapping stamps, altered dates, signatures that don't match official records. Miller and Julian exchanged panicked looks. The situation had turned completely against them, and now they faced not only losing Lily, but also the possibility of facing criminal charges. This isn't over, Miller said, heading for his car. You don't know who you're messing with. But before he could leave, Anne Bailey gestured to her assistants. Mr. Marcus Miller, you are being summoned to testify about irregularities in the administration of minors under your responsibility. And Mr. Julian Baxter, you are suspended from your duties until further notice. Lily, who had remained quiet in Grace's arms throughout the confrontation, finally spoke. Are the other kids going to be saved too? It was Owen who answered, crouching down to her level. We're going to do everything we can to save all of them, little one. But Grace knew the fight was just beginning, and that Miller wouldn't easily give up a business that clearly brought him a lot of money and power. In the weeks following the confrontation with Miller, Grace discovered that life hadn't gotten easier, just more complicated in different ways. Although Lily was officially safe under the shared custody of her and Hope, the threat of Miller loomed over them all like a dark cloud. Owen had moved back into the house, but slept on the living room sofa, respecting the space that 2 years of abandonment had created between him and Grace. During the day, he went out to gather more evidence against Miller, working with Anne Bailey and other social workers to build a solid case against the illegal operation. I found 3 more kids who managed to escape his property, Owen said one January morning, having coffee with Grace on the porch. They're hiding in an isolated bayou settlement upriver, but they're too scared to talk officially. And Miller, has he tried anything? Grace asked, watching Lily and Hope play in the yard. The girl had gradually grown closer to her biological mother, but still showed a preference for the safety she felt with Grace. He's being more careful now, Owen replied, but he hasn't given up. We've heard he's moved several children from the Cypress Creek property to other locations. He's scattering the evidence to make any investigation more difficult. Grace's financial situation remained desperate. Without her boat, she had no way to work, and the little money Hope earned selling fish at the market barely covered Lily's basic needs. Owen contributed what he could from odd jobs, but it wasn't enough to support a family. It was during one of these difficult mornings that Brenda appeared with an unexpected proposal. She had gradually transformed from a rigid bureaucrat into a genuinely concerned ally for Lily's well-being. "I have a work opportunity for you," she said, sitting on the porch next to Grace. "The city is creating a sustainable eco-tourism program. They need local guides who know the region's rivers well." "But I don't have a boat anymore," Grace reminded her bitterly. "The city will provide the boats," Brenda explained. "It's part of the program. And there's a special condition. Families who have taken in vulnerable children have priority in hiring." The proposal was tempting, but Grace had learned to be wary of offers that seemed too good to be true. "What's the catch?" "There's always a catch. The program is being coordinated by a consortium of local business owners," Brenda said, hesitating. "One of the main investors is Marcus Miller." The silence that followed was heavy. Grace immediately understood that this was another attempt by Miller to exert control over their lives, using his economic influence as leverage. "He's trying to buy us," she said finally. "Or control us," added Hope, who had come closer to listen to the conversation. "If we agree to work for him, directly or indirectly, he'll use it as a form of blackmail." That afternoon, while Lily played in the yard under the supervision of Diana, who had become a regular presence at the house, the three women, Grace, Hope, and Brenda, gathered to discuss alternatives. "We can't keep living in fear of him forever," Hope said, "and we can't let other children suffer what Lily suffered." "The problem is, he has powerful connections," Brenda reminded them. "Even with the evidence Owen has collected, getting a conviction will be difficult, and in the meantime, he's free to do whatever he wants." It was Grace who suggested the idea that would change everything. "What if instead of trying to fight him through the official system, we organized the community itself?" "What do you mean?" Hope asked. "Miller has power because people are afraid of him or depend on him economically," Grace explained. "But if we could organize the fish vendors, the fishermen, the families who have been affected by his actions, if we created a mutual support network that didn't depend on him." Brenda was excited by the idea. A cooperative. The fishermen could sell directly to consumers, bypassing the middlemen Miller controls. The families could support each other with childcare and education. In the following weeks, the idea began to take shape. Diana used her position at City Hall to identify other families who had been harmed by Miller. Owen applied his river navigation experience to organize transport routes that didn't rely on the infrastructure controlled by the businessmen. Hope, despite her initial shyness, proved to be a natural organizer, knowing dozens of fishermen and vendors who were tired of accepting the low prices imposed by Miller. "There are more people on our side than we thought," she said at a meeting at Grace's house. "The problem was always that each family faced their problems alone. Now that we're talking to each other..." The informal cooperative's first victory was small but significant. They managed to organize an independent fish fair in a square near the central market, offering better prices for both fishermen and consumers, eliminating the abusive profit of the middlemen. Miller reacted quickly, using his influence to try to shut down the fair through supposed health code violations. But Diana had prepared all the necessary paperwork in advance, and Anne Bailey mobilized other social workers to provide legal support for the initiative. "He's nervous," Owen observed during a nightly meeting. "He started making desperate moves. Yesterday, he tried to bribe 3 families to stop participating in the cooperative." "And did it work?" Grace asked, concerned. 2 families accepted," Hope admitted, "but 5 others joined us. The movement is growing faster than he can fight it." It was at that moment that Lily, who was supposed to be asleep, appeared in the living room. "Aunt Grace," she said in her small voice, "the mean uncle is outside." Everyone turned to the windows. Outside, parked on the dark street, was Miller's car. He had gotten out of the vehicle and was walking slowly toward the house, accompanied by two men no one recognized. "Call Anne Bailey," Owen said quickly to Diana, "and the police." But before anyone could make the call, Miller banged on the door with excessive force. "Grace, Hope, I know you're in there. I need to talk to you." His voice was slurred, clearly under the influence of alcohol, and there was a dangerous anger in his tone that made all the women instinctively position themselves between him and Lily. "You think you can destroy me?" he shouted through the door. "You think this crappy little cooperative is going to make a difference? I built an empire here in Port Serenity. I'm not going to let a bunch of frustrated women take me down." Owen approached the door, but didn't open it. "Miller, go away. The police have been called." "The police?" Miller laughed bitterly. "Half the cops in this town owe me favors. You think they're going to arrest me for what? For offering work to orphaned children?" It was then that he said something that completely changed the tone of the situation. "By the way, Hope, maybe you'd like to know how your younger sister really ended up working for me." Hope froze. "What are you saying?" "Carly isn't working in a cannery like you think," Miller said with calculated cruelty. "She's been on my Cypress Creek property for 3 years, and if you don't stop this rebellion, she's going to find out that accidents can happen to people who don't cooperate." The silence that followed was deafening. Hope had gone completely pale, and Grace realized that Miller had just revealed that his operation was even larger and more sinister than anyone had imagined. The revelation about Carly hit Hope like a physical blow. She sank into a chair, her hands trembling as she tried to process that her younger sister had been missing for 3 years. And she had never suspected, because Miller had created a convincing story about a job at a distant factory. "Carly is only 19, Hope murmured, tears streaming down her face. She's been there all this time?" Miller continued from outside, his drunken voice growing more threatening. "Now you understand the situation. Stop this stupid cooperative. Hand over Lily to me, and maybe Carly will have a less severe accident." Owen looked out the window and saw that the two men with Miller looked nervous, constantly looking around as if expecting the police to arrive. "They won't do anything here," he whispered to the women. "Miller is desperate, but he's still smart enough not to commit direct violence where he can be seen." It was at that moment that Diana had an idea that would change everything. "Hope," she said urgently, "do you remember the old cell phone Carly left here before she left for work?" "I remember. It's stored in my chest." If she were really working in a factory, she would have taken her phone. The fact that she left it here. Diana paused, organizing her thoughts. What if we could track its signal? If Miller forced her to leave the phone so she couldn't be tracked, but kept it as a form of control? Owen understood immediately. "You're thinking he might have her phone at the property as some kind of trophy or leverage." While Miller continued shouting outside, now also threatening to destroy the fishermen's cooperative and ruin the lives of all the families involved, the women worked quickly to contact Anne Bailey and devise a plan. "I need you to record everything he's saying," Anne said over the phone. "Direct threats, blackmail, admission of holding people against their will. That's enough evidence for a search and seizure warrant for his property." Grace turned on her phone's recording function and approached the door. "Miller," she shouted, "are you admitting you kidnapped Carly?" "Kidnapped?" He laughed drunkenly. "She works for me voluntarily, just like the other girls. They like the work I provide for them." Hope gathered her courage and approached the window. "Carly would never accept that voluntarily. You're lying." "Wanna bet? Want to see your little sister again? Then stop playing the hero and bring Lily to me tomorrow, noon, at the Cypress Creek property. Otherwise, Carly is going to have a very painful accident. The two men with Miller finally convinced him to leave when they saw car lights approaching. It was Anne Bailey, accompanied by two investigators and a court officer. When Anne heard the recording, her expression became determined. "This is more than enough. We'll organize an operation for tomorrow morning before the noon deadline he mentioned." But Hope shook her head. "We can't wait until tomorrow. If Miller realizes you're organizing an official operation, he could kill Carly and hide the evidence." "What are you suggesting?" Anne asked. "That I go to the property tonight," Hope said, surprising everyone. "Not to hand over Lily, but to rescue Carly and the other victims before Miller can react." "That's too dangerous," Grace protested. "You can't go alone." "I won't go alone," Hope said, looking at Owen. "I need someone who knows the rivers well and can navigate in the dark." Owen nodded immediately. "I know every bend of Cypress Creek. I can get you to the property without being detected." Anne hesitated, clearly torn between official protocol and the urgency of the situation. "Officially, I can't authorize an operation like this, but if you go as concerned citizens checking on a rural property, and if you happen to find evidence of crimes—" "We understand," Owen said. "We are not acting as official agents." Diana offered to stay with Lily and Grace, while Brenda would coordinate with Anne to have a rescue team ready to act as soon as they received a signal. At 2 in the morning, Hope and Owen set off in a small motorized canoe borrowed from one of the cooperative's fishermen. The bayou night was dark and humid, with only the soft sound of the engine and the occasional cry of a nocturnal animal breaking the silence. When they reached the outskirts of Miller's property, they found a scene that surpassed their worst expectations. There were at least 12 children and young people sleeping in deplorable conditions in a makeshift shed, while 2 drunk guards made a careless patrol around the main buildings. Hope located Carly in one of the rooms of the main house. Her sister was alive, but visibly traumatized and malnourished. When Hope whispered her name through the barred window, Carly initially thought she was dreaming. "Hope? Are you real?" she murmured, touching her sister's hand through the bars. "I'm real and I've come to get you out," Hope promised. "Can you walk?" "I can, but—" "The other girls. I can't leave them here." It was then that Hope understood the true extent of Miller's operation. It wasn't just children working. There were young women being held captive, forced to work, and suffering abuses she didn't even want to imagine. Owen had managed to disable the property's main generator, plunging everything into darkness. In the chaos that followed, with the guards trying to figure out what had happened, Hope and Carly managed to open the rooms where the other victims were locked. "Run to the river," Hope whispered to the group of 8 young women and 4 children they had managed to free. "There's a boat waiting." But when they reached the spot where Owen had hidden the canoe, they found Miller waiting for them, accompanied by 3 men armed with machetes. "Did you think it would be that easy?" he said, clearly more sober now, but just as dangerous. "You've just signed the death sentence for all these people." It was at that moment that the sound of multiple boat engines echoed down the river. Anne Bailey had coordinated with the state police and the district attorney's office to organize a simultaneous rescue operation, using the time Hope and Owen had bought them to gather enough evidence for a search and seizure warrant. "Marcus Miller!" a magnified voice shouted from the approaching boats. "You are surrounded. Surrender and release the hostages." The ensuing operation was swift and efficient. Miller and his accomplices were arrested, the victims were rescued and received immediate medical attention, and the property was thoroughly investigated, revealing evidence of a slave labor operation that extended far beyond what anyone had imagined. 3 months later, Grace was on her porch, watching Lily and Carly play in the yard with other neighborhood children. The Fishermen's Cooperative had become a model of success, offering sustainable economic alternatives for dozens of families. Hope had officially regained custody of Lily, but the girl still spent most of her time with Grace, who had become a second mother to her. Owen had rebuilt his relationship with Grace, and together they had bought a new boat with the funds earned through the cooperative. Brenda had been promoted to Regional Coordinator for Child and Adolescent Protection, using her experience in the Miller case to develop more effective protocols for identifying and combating child labor. "Aunt Grace," Lily said, running to the porch with a drawing in her hands, "look what I made." It was a drawing of a large family with many people holding hands around a house. In the center, a little girl smiled, surrounded by protective adults. "It's our family," Lily explained, pointing to each figure. "You, Mommy Hope, Uncle Owen, Aunt Diana, Aunt Brenda, Aunt Anne, and Carly, everyone who takes care of me." Grace hugged the girl, feeling a deep gratitude for having found Lily that afternoon on the river. What had begun as a desperate attempt to save a lost child had turned into a journey of discovery about the strength of communities united against injustice. Miller was sentenced to 15 years in prison for slave labor, false imprisonment, and sexual exploitation of minors. But his legal punishment was only part of the justice. The real victory was in the network of protection and mutual support that the families of Port Serenity had built, ensuring that no child would ever again suffer in silence as long as the community remained united and vigilant. If you liked this video, please subscribe to my channel. I promise to bring you videos every day that will make your life happier. Comment what you thought of my story, giving it a rating from 0 to 10. And thank you very much.